The morning air at the New York airport was heavy with the usual rush of travelers. People hurried through the terminal, juggling luggage, coffee cups, and conversations. It was one of those mornings when every gate was crowded, every announcement echoed through the speakers, and patience seemed to be in short supply. At gate C-12, a flight to Los Angeles was boarding. The flight was packed with a mix of business travelers, families, and tourists. Near the front of the line stood a tall black man, dressed neatly in a simple button-down shirt and dark trousers. His calm presence stood out amid the noise. He held his ticket in one hand, a quiet smile on his face as he waited for his group to board. When the attendant scanned his ticket, she smiled politely and said, "Welcome aboard, sir. You're in seat 2A, first class." He nodded with a warm, "Thank you," and stepped onto the plane. Inside, the first-class cabin smelled faintly of coffee and leather seats. He placed his small carry-on in the overhead compartment, sat down, and quietly adjusted his seatbelt. The man wasn't flashy, no gold watches, no designer bags, but there was something about the way he carried himself, calm, confident, respectful, that drew subtle attention. He pulled out a book and began reading as passengers continued boarding. A few people glanced his way, then went back to finding their seats. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until a few minutes later, a white woman, likely in her mid-50s, stepped into the cabin. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a crisp white blouse with a string of pearls. From the moment she entered, her body language screamed authority, the kind of person used to being obeyed. She looked around for her seat, clutching her designer handbag tightly until her eyes fell on the man in 2A. Her face changed instantly, her brows pulled together and a frown formed. She stopped in the aisle and said loudly enough for others to hear, "Excuse me, I think you're in the wrong seat." The man looked up politely, his tone calm. "I don't think so, ma'am. My ticket says 2A. She let out a sharp laugh, the kind that carried judgment more than humor. "I doubt that," she said. "This is first class." Her words were sharp, and several nearby passengers turned their heads. The man stayed composed. He simply reached into his pocket and showed her his ticket. The print clearly read Seat 2A, first class, but the woman didn't even look at it. She crossed her arms and said, "You must have made a mistake. Maybe they upgraded you by accident." The man didn't respond right away. He just offered a patient smile, then went back to his book. That seemed to annoy her even more. "Excuse me, I'm talking to you," she snapped. "You can't just sit wherever you want." Before the situation could go further, a flight attendant approached. "Is everything okay here?" she asked gently. The woman pointed toward the man. "He's in the wrong seat. I paid for first class. This isn't right." The attendant looked at the man's ticket, confirmed it matched the seat, and replied politely, "Ma'am, he is in the correct seat. You're actually in 2B, just next to him." The woman's lips parted in disbelief. "You mean next to him?" "Yes, ma'am," the attendant said. "That's your seat." The woman stood frozen for a moment, her expression full of discomfort. A few passengers in first class exchanged glances, sensing where this was going. The man didn't look up again. He simply turned a page in his book. Still muttering, the woman sat down reluctantly beside him. She sighed dramatically and said, "Well, this is unbelievable." She pulled out a hand sanitizer bottle and wiped her armrest as if it were contaminated. The flight attendant walked away, trying to maintain peace, but she could still hear the woman mumbling under her breath. Things like, "This airline has gone downhill and you can't even travel in peace anymore." A few minutes later, boarding was complete. The plane doors closed and the engines began to hum. The man looked out the window, calm as ever, while the woman fidgeted and sighed. Then she spoke again, this time louder, as if wanting others to hear. "It's just ridiculous," she said. "Some people really don't know their place anymore." That sentence caught the attention of a young couple sitting nearby. The woman turned her head slightly and gave a disapproving look, but said nothing. The man in 2A still didn't respond. Instead, he took a deep breath, closed his book, and leaned back. His silence made her even more uneasy. She shifted in her seat and said, "You must have used miles or something. That's the only way this could happen." He finally looked at her, his tone soft but firm. "Ma'am, I paid for this seat just like you did. We'll both get to Los Angeles the same way, whether you like it or not." Her mouth fell open slightly, not used to someone answering her so calmly. "Well," she said with a small scoff. I guess standards aren't what they used to be. The man didn't respond this time. He simply put his earphones in and closed his eyes. The plane began to taxi. The flight attendant gave the safety demonstration, though most people weren't paying much attention. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the engines roared louder. Soon the plane lifted off the ground, climbing above the clouds. For a while there was silence, just the steady hum of the engines. The woman didn't speak again, but her posture showed irritation. She kept glancing sideways at the man, as if expecting him to do something wrong. At one point she pressed the call button and asked the attendant for sparkling water. When it arrived, she said, "Could you make sure it's properly sealed? You never know." The flight attendant's polite smile didn't fade, but there was tension in her eyes. "Of course, ma'am," she said and walked away. Meanwhile, the man quietly scrolled through photos on his phone. Family pictures, smiling faces, kids in school uniforms. His expression softened slightly as he looked at them. The woman noticed, her curiosity briefly overcoming her irritation. "So," she said finally, "what do you do for a living?" He looked up and replied, "I work for the government." Her brows lifted slightly. "Oh, in what department?" He smiled faintly. "Just defense work. Mostly administrative these days." She gave a short laugh. "I see. Well, good for you." She turned back toward her window, clearly uninterested, assuming she now understood him. But she was very wrong. As the flight continued, the crew served breakfast. The man thanked the attendant politely, and even helped the older passenger across the aisle who was struggling to open her tray table. The woman beside him said nothing, though she watched quietly, her earlier boldness starting to fade just a little. Still, every now and then she muttered things like, "I just don't understand why they mix everyone together now." She probably thought no one could hear, but a teenage boy sitting a few rows back caught it all and shook his head. 2 hours later, the cabin lights dimmed again. Most passengers began to rest. The man leaned his head against the seat and closed his eyes. The woman glanced at him again, her expression still uneasy. She whispered softly to herself, "People just pretend to be something they're not these days." The words were quiet but cruel. The man opened his eyes, turned slightly toward her and said calmly, "You're right about one thing, ma'am. Some people do pretend, but others don't need to. They just live with dignity." For a moment she didn't know what to say. Her lips parted, but no words came out. There was something in his voice, and not anger, not sarcasm, just quiet confidence that left her speechless. The rest of the flight passed in near silence. The man returned to his book, while the woman avoided eye contact completely. The tension was still there, but something about the man's calmness made it impossible for her to keep pushing. Every so often, the flight attendants passed by, checking on passengers. They smiled at the man each time, recognizing the quiet respect he showed them. When the captain's voice came over the speakers announcing their descent into Los Angeles, the cabin slowly came alive again. Seatbelts clicked, trays were lifted, and sunlight filled the windows. The woman adjusted her seatbelt and glanced once more toward the man. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. Maybe she was realizing that she had misjudged someone who never once disrespected her. He caught her glance and offered a small, polite nod. She hesitated, then looked away, pretending to adjust her bag. As the plane dipped toward the city below, no one in that cabin, not even the woman, could guess who the quiet man in 2A really was. But soon, everyone would find out, and when they did, this uncomfortable flight would become a story the world would talk about for weeks. The seatbelt sign stayed on as the plane continued its smooth flight across the country. Outside, the clouds drifted lazily beneath the wings, bright and endless in the sunlight. Inside, however, the air was thick with quiet tension. The man in seat 2A had barely moved since takeoff. His calmness hadn't changed. He occasionally reached for a sip of water, turned a page in his book, or adjusted his earphones, but not once did he lose his composure. The woman beside him, though, couldn't seem to relax. She fidgeted every few minutes, checking her watch, sighing dramatically and glancing at him like his very presence was a disturbance. She wasn't saying anything out loud now, but her restless movement spoke volumes. When the attendant came by again, offering refills for drinks, the woman smiled sweetly at her and said in a hushed tone, "I'm not trying to be difficult, but are you sure he's supposed to be here? I just want to make sure everything's in order." The attendant froze for a second, then smiled politely. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. "Everything's in order. Please let us know if you need anything else." But her tone had changed. Firmer this time. The woman looked offended by that firmness. She muttered something under her breath that sounded like, "Unbelievable," then returned to scrolling through her phone. The man didn't react. He just kept reading as if he hadn't heard a word. After a while, the plane entered some mild turbulence. The captain's voice came over the speakers, calm and professional, asking everyone to fasten their seatbelts. The aircraft shook gently as it moved through a patch of rough air. The woman gasped softly, clutching the armrest. Her posture stiffened, and for the first time she seemed genuinely nervous. The man noticed and turned to her, his voice kind. "It's just turbulence, ma'am. Happens on most flights. Nothing to worry about." She didn't answer at first, then said quietly, "I don't like flying." He nodded slowly. "A lot of people don't, but you're safe. The pilots know exactly what they're doing." Something in his voice, calm, steady, reassuring, seemed to settle her nerves. She nodded once, not looking directly at him. The turbulence passed after a few minutes and the seatbelt sign switched off. But something about that small exchange changed the energy between them. She didn't look quite as harsh anymore. Her body relaxed slightly. Maybe for the first time she saw him as just another passenger, not as someone who didn't belong. Still, her pride kept her from saying anything kind. Instead, she adjusted her scarf and said, "I suppose you travel a lot for work?" He smiled faintly. "You could say that. Where to?" she asked, trying to sound casual but still curious. "All over," he replied. "Sometimes overseas. Mostly for meetings." She nodded, pretending to be uninterested. "Meetings, huh? You must be in some kind of business." "Something like that," he said quietly, not offering more. The conversation faded, and silence filled the space again. But she couldn't help glancing at him every now and then, her mind spinning with questions she didn't ask. A while later, the attendants came around with lunch service. As they served the first-class cabin, the man thanked them with genuine warmth each time they stopped by. His manners were effortless, not showy, not forced, just kind. The woman, on the other hand, seemed determined to get extra attention. "I asked for lemon in my water," she said, frowning slightly. The attendant apologized gently, then brought her a slice of lemon within seconds. Still, she sighed and muttered, "Service isn't what it used to be." When the attendant left, the man looked at her calmly and said, "You know, they work really hard. It's not easy dealing with so many people at once." She raised an eyebrow. "You sound like you know," he smiled again. "In my line of work, I deal with people under pressure every day." "You learn to be patient. Must be nice," she said flatly, clearly not understanding what he meant. He didn't respond, just focused on his meal. A few minutes later, one of the attendants accidentally dropped a napkin near the aisle. Before she could bend down to pick it up, the man in 2A was already leaning forward, handing it back to her. "Here you go," he said kindly. The young attendant smiled gratefully. "Thank you, sir." "No problem," he replied. The woman rolled her eyes slightly but didn't say anything this time. She looked out the window instead, her reflection visible in the glass. For a moment she seemed lost in thought. As the flight went on, the mood in the cabin shifted little by little. People began to relax and conversations filled the air again. The man in 2A kept to himself, quietly reading a newspaper now. Then a new voice spoke from behind them, a young man's voice. "Hey," he said, leaning slightly forward. "I just wanted to say, that was really cool of you helping the attendant earlier." The man smiled and nodded politely. "Thank you." The older woman turned slightly, looking annoyed that anyone would interrupt her peace. "People are just being polite," she said under her breath. But this time, several passengers heard her and didn't agree. One of them, a woman across the aisle, said softly, "Ma'am, you don't need to be rude. He's done nothing wrong." The older woman's face tightened. "Excuse me?" "I wasn't being rude," she said sharply. The cabin grew quiet again. The man sighed softly, then said, "It's all right. Let's not make this a bigger thing." But the other passengers didn't seem ready to let it slide. A middle-aged man spoke from behind, saying, "No, it's not all right. Some people think they're better than others, and that's the problem." The woman looked shocked. "How dare you? You don't even know me." The flight attendant quickly returned, trying to calm things down. "Everyone, please. Let's stay respectful. We still have a few hours to go. The passengers quieted down, though the atmosphere stayed heavy. The man in 2A kept his calm expression, but inside, he was thinking about how easily people could lose kindness over something so small. He glanced at the woman beside him and said quietly, "You know, ma'am, it doesn't take much to make a flight peaceful." "Just a little respect," she didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. After a while, the attendants dimmed the lights, signaling that passengers could rest. The hum of the engines was steady, and the soft blue glow of the cabin lights filled the room. The woman leaned her seat back slightly, pretending to sleep, but her mind wasn't resting. Her thoughts replayed everything that had happened, the looks from other passengers, the calmness of the man beside her, the way everyone seemed to side with him. It bothered her more than she wanted to admit, but part of her also felt something she hadn't expected. Guilt. She had spoken carelessly, and now the silence beside her made that weight sink in. Meanwhile, the man wasn't thinking about her anymore. His thoughts were far away, about his team waiting for him in Los Angeles, the meetings lined up, and the quiet pressure of leadership he carried every day. He wasn't angry, not really. He had seen worse behavior in far more serious situations. But what struck him was how often people judged others based on nothing more than appearances. He had lived long enough to know that prejudice didn't always come in loud words. Sometimes it came in quiet assumptions. The hours passed slowly. The attendants served light snacks, checked on passengers, and dimmed the lights again as the plane moved closer to California. At one point, the woman beside him stirred and said softly, "I didn't mean to cause a scene earlier." He turned to her, his face kind. "You didn't cause a scene. People just have different ways of seeing things," she hesitated. "I just thought, well, never mind. It doesn't matter." "It always matters," he said quietly. "But what matters more is how we move forward." She looked away, clearly unsure how to respond. For a few minutes there was silence again. Then, trying to change the subject, she asked, "So you work for the government, right? You must have an important job." He gave a small laugh. "Some would say that. But I'm just doing my duty." She nodded awkwardly. "Well, I suppose it must be stressful." "It can be," he said, "but I've learned that staying calm helps everyone else stay calm too." His tone was simple, but his words had weight. She could feel it, though she didn't understand why. The rest of the flight stayed quiet. The cabin lights brightened again as the plane prepared for descent. The pilot announced they would be landing soon in Los Angeles. Passengers began to gather their belongings, stretch their legs, and prepare for arrival. The woman glanced once more at the man beside her, but this time her look wasn't filled with judgment, it was curiosity. Something about him didn't add up. His calm, his words, his composure, they weren't ordinary. She thought to herself, who exactly is this man? As the plane began to descend through the clouds, she didn't realize that the answer to that question would leave her speechless, and in just a few minutes, the world around her would change completely. The sun was high above the clouds now, turning the airplane cabin bright and warm. Passengers began to wake up from naps, stretching quietly and checking their watches. The flight from New York to Los Angeles was halfway through. The air inside the cabin had calmed, though a quiet tension still floated between the man in seat 2A and the woman beside him. She hadn't said much since their last exchange. Every now and then she'd glance toward him, but when he met her eyes, she quickly looked away. The arrogance that had colored her tone earlier had faded, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, maybe even embarrassment. The man, however, remained steady. He seemed untouched by the earlier drama. He had that rare kind of calm that made other people either admire him or question how he did it. He was reading again, a small notepad open beside his book. His handwriting was neat, deliberate. He paused every few minutes to jot something down, then continued reading. The woman couldn't help herself. Curiosity had replaced her irritation. She leaned slightly to the side, pretending to adjust her seatbelt, just to sneak a look at what he was writing. But the handwriting was small, and all she could make out were a few short words, something about briefing, arrival, and report. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You really do work for the government, don't you?" she said quietly. He looked up, surprised she was speaking again, but his tone stayed polite. "That's right." She hesitated, then said, You don't look like someone who sits in meetings all day." He smiled a little. Maybe that's because I don't. Her curiosity deepened. So what do you do exactly? He gave a light shrug. A bit of coordination. Sometimes I travel for security projects. Sometimes I train people. It depends, she blinked. Train people? Like teaching? In a way, he said, his voice calm. I help teams stay ready for situations that could get complicated fast. It was clear he wasn't trying to brag, just explaining. But his words carried weight, like someone who had seen more than he was willing to say. The woman leaned back, still puzzled. Sounds important. It's just my job, he said softly, turning another page. A small silence followed. The engines hummed steadily and the sound of clinking glasses from the attendants filled the background. Then from behind them a voice broke the calm. Excuse me, someone shouted from a few rows back. Everyone turned slightly to look. A man in economy was standing, arguing with a flight attendant. His voice was tense. I told you my seat won't recline properly. I've been trying for an hour. The attendant spoke gently, trying to keep her voice calm. Sir, please lower your voice. I'll help you once we're at cruising altitude again. But the passenger wasn't having it. He kept arguing, his frustration growing louder. A few people began whispering. The flight attendants looked tense, unsure whether to involve the captain. The woman in 2B frowned and whispered, People really have no manners these days. The man beside her didn't answer. Instead, he unbuckled his seatbelt slowly and stood up. The woman blinked in surprise. Where are you going? Just a moment, he said quietly, stepping past her. He walked calmly down the aisle, his movements slow and steady. Passengers watched curiously. When he reached the man arguing with the attendant, he spoke in a low, steady tone. Sir, he said, I understand you're upset. But this isn't helping anyone. Let her fix it for you. She's just doing her job. The angry passenger turned sharply. Who are you supposed to be? The man didn't answer that question directly. Someone asking you to take a breath, he said evenly. You're on a plane full of people trying to get home safely. Let's not make their flight harder. The tone wasn't harsh, but it carried quiet authority, the kind that made people stop and listen. The angry passenger hesitated. He looked around and noticed others staring at him, some with phones halfway raised. His shoulders dropped slightly. Fine, he muttered, and sat down. The man nodded once, gave the attendant a reassuring glance, and returned to his seat. The woman watched him the entire time, her expression unreadable. When he sat back down, she said softly, You handled that like a professional. He smiled faintly. Sometimes people just need to feel heard, she nodded slowly. Still, on the way you spoke, you have that tone people listen to. He looked out the window. I've had practice. For the first time, she smiled faintly, just a hint. You're not an ordinary traveler, are you? He didn't answer. The flight continued peacefully after that. The attendants came by to thank him quietly, their expressions full of gratitude. He nodded politely, insisting it was nothing, but passengers nearby kept glancing his way now, curious about who he was. Something about the way he had handled the situation didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like instinct. Hours passed, and soon the announcement came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Los Angeles shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing. The cabin lights brightened, and the familiar bustle began. People putting away headphones, finishing drinks, straightening their seats. The woman took a slow breath, still glancing toward the man beside her. There was something about him she couldn't shake. That steady energy, the quiet confidence. You must be important, she said suddenly, her voice low. He chuckled softly. Everyone's important to someone. No, she said, shaking her head slightly. I mean, I can tell. You carry yourself differently. Like you've seen things the rest of us haven't. He gave her a thoughtful look. Maybe. But most of what I've seen I wouldn't wish on anyone else. Her eyes softened a little. That sounds heavy. He nodded, his gaze turning distant. It can be, but it teaches you what matters. The woman didn't know what to say to that. She turned toward the window and watched the city lights begin to appear below the clouds. As the plane lowered through the sky, the engines grew quieter. The familiar rumble of landing gear came next. The attendants made their final checks, walking briskly through the aisle. When the plane touched down, the passengers clapped softly, that small, relieved gesture people often make after a long flight. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, cheerful and calm, thanking everyone for flying and wishing them a pleasant stay. The seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers began standing, opening overhead bins and stretching. The woman reached for her bag, but it was stuck between two larger suitcases. She tugged a few times, frustrated. "Here," the man said, standing and reaching up easily. He moved the bags aside with careful precision, lifted hers, and handed it to her gently. She blinked, then managed a small, sincere smile. "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said, his tone friendly as ever. They stood quietly as the line of passengers started to move toward the exit. The attendants at the front smiled as the man approached. One of them whispered something into her headset, and a few seconds later the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out, smiling widely. "There you are," he said warmly. "Good to have you with us, sir." The woman's head snapped around. "Wait," she said softly. "You know him?" The captain laughed lightly. "Of course. We were notified before departure. Always an honor when he's on board." The woman looked completely lost. Who is he?" she asked under her breath. Before anyone could answer, a uniformed officer entered the plane from the jet bridge, walking straight toward them. The passengers in the aisle froze, watching curiously. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said, standing tall. "We've been expecting you." The man nodded casually. "Thank you. Appreciate the escort." He picked up his small carry-on and turned to the woman beside him. "It was nice sitting next to you," he said gently. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. As he stepped off the plane, the flight attendants straightened instinctively, their expressions filled with respect. The officer followed closely behind him. The woman stayed standing, staring after him, her heart racing. She felt every ounce of her earlier behavior pressed down like a heavy weight. The other passengers began whispering. Someone said softly, "Did you see that? He must be someone important." Another said, "I think he's military. Did you hear how they spoke to him?" The woman slowly sank back into her seat, her hands trembling slightly. She had wanted to be the person in control, the one others looked up to. But now, as she watched the calm man walk off the plane with quiet authority, she realized she had misjudged him from the moment she saw him. And though she didn't know his full story yet, one thing was already clear. She had just embarrassed herself in front of someone whose respect was worth more than she could ever imagine. Outside the window, she could see several airport staff greeting him near the gate. They shook his hand firmly and spoke with clear admiration. Cameras flashed somewhere in the distance, her face grew pale. She turned away quickly, sinking lower in her seat, wishing she could disappear. But it was too late. The moment had already written itself into her memory, a quiet lesson that would follow her far beyond that flight. And she still didn't know the half of it. The plane had landed smoothly in Los Angeles. The engines hummed softly as the passengers began gathering their belongings. The cabin was a mixture of movement, chatter, and the occasional clatter of luggage being tugged from overhead compartments. The woman who had spent most of the flight beside the man in 2A sat frozen for a few seconds, staring at the aisle. She had tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just another passenger. But now, seeing him rise from his seat, composed and collected, she felt a sinking weight in her chest. He adjusted his jacket neatly and picked up his small carry-on. Every movement he made was deliberate, controlled, as if he had rehearsed his exit in his mind long before stepping onto the plane. The flight attendants straightened instinctively, their expressions respectful, yet not in the exaggerated way one might expect with a celebrity. This respect felt genuine, earned. As he walked down the aisle, passengers watched. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin. Some leaned forward, curious to see who this man was. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the nervous energy of the woman who had humiliated him earlier. She tried to shrink into her seat, hoping he wouldn't notice her, but he did. His eyes flicked toward her, and he gave a small, polite nod. The woman's stomach sank. The nod wasn't just a greeting. It felt like a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had happened between them on the flight. She had expected anger, confrontation, perhaps even a raised voice. But instead she received calm dignity. That simple gesture made her pulse quicken, a mixture of shame and awe coursing through her. Passengers murmured among themselves. "Who is he?" Someone whispered. He handled that situation so calmly. And the flight attendants? They're acting differently. Others quietly watched, sensing that this wasn't a man to be underestimated. The woman's fingers clenched around the strap of her bag, her knuckles white. Every instinct she had used to assert herself earlier now seemed small, foolish, and irrelevant. At the front of the plane, the flight attendants were ready. They had been briefed about this passenger before takeoff, though most other passengers hadn't known. A uniformed officer was waiting by the gate, and the captain was standing nearby, smiling in a way that betrayed both relief and respect. The man reached the front of the cabin. He greeted the officer calmly, extending a hand which was firmly shaken in return. A few words were exchanged quietly, their tone professional, precise. Though no one on the plane could hear the conversation, the way the officer stood straight and attentive said enough. The woman beside the aisle seat watched, her face pale and tense. She finally realized she had completely misjudged him. Every stereotype, every assumption she had clung to during the flight now seemed absurd. The man she had judged, humiliated, and disrespected had carried himself with a calm authority that made her feel small without any effort. As he prepared to leave, the cabin doors opened fully to the airport terminal. Sunlight flooded in and passengers began moving toward the exit. The man walked steadily down the aisle, the officer at his side. A few curious passengers tried to follow, discreetly taking out their phones, whispering to each other. Suddenly, cameras began flashing from the airport side of the jet bridge. Reporters and photographers had been waiting, their cameras trained on the man as he approached. The officers guided him carefully, and the flight attendants stepped aside, their expressions filled with respect rather than awe. The woman finally understood. This wasn't just someone important. This was someone extraordinary, someone whose presence commanded respect in a way she had never experienced firsthand. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. "Is he military?" someone asked quietly. Another passenger replied, "I think he might be high-ranking. Look how everyone is reacting." The woman's hands trembled slightly. She tried to speak, to form an apology, but no words came. The man paused at the threshold, turning slightly to acknowledge the cabin. His gaze met hers once again. There was no anger, no bitterness, just calm dignity. She realized that everything she had done, every rude word, every judgment, had not affected him the way she had imagined. As the man stepped onto the terminal floor, the officers formally greeted him. Their respect was precise, professional, and unmistakable. One of them said something quietly, but the tone of the voice, firm, attentive, and deferential, made it clear that this was no ordinary passenger. A few reporters stepped forward, cameras raised. "Sir, may we ask your name?" one called politely. The man gave a small nod, his voice calm but carrying authority. "I'd rather not speak publicly right now," he said. "I appreciate your patience." But a few photographers captured every detail, and a sense of curiosity and respect rippled through everyone present. The woman finally looked around and noticed the uniformed officers and the careful attention of the crew. Her stomach sank further. She had humiliated someone on a flight without knowing anything about him, and now she could see the full consequences of her ignorance. Outside the plane, several more officers approached, guiding him toward a private vehicle. A few passengers tried to follow discreetly, but most stayed back, sensing that this was not their place. The man's calm demeanor never faltered. He moved with precision, but there was a natural ease to him, the kind of ease that only comes from someone who is in full control of themselves and their surroundings. Inside the terminal, the woman finally sat down, trying to process everything she had just witnessed. Her heart raced, a mix of fear, embarrassment, and awe. She thought back to the flight, how she had spoken, how she had assumed, how she had tried to assert dominance over someone she barely knew, and now in the light of reality, she realized just how small and foolish her behavior had seemed. Meanwhile, the man stepped into a waiting vehicle, surrounded by officers. The reporters kept a respectful distance, cameras still snapping, as the car doors closed. He gave a small wave to the onlookers, polite but measured, before the vehicle began to move. Passengers remaining in the plane whispered to each other, trying to piece together who he was. "He's clearly someone important," Military, maybe even higher, one said. Another shook his head. I can't believe we sat next to him without knowing. He didn't even brag, and yet everyone treats him like he's in charge of the country. The woman could only sit in her seat, feeling the weight of her own assumptions pressing down on her. She had come onto the flight confident, full of certainty, and now she was humbled. The quiet dignity of the man had done what anger and pride could never do. It had revealed her own flaws without a single raised voice or harsh word. A flight attendant came back to the cabin to collect remaining service items and to close the plane for disembarking. She offered a small, understanding smile to the woman, who avoided eye contact. Sir, the attendant said, pointing to the exit. He handled himself perfectly. You saw that, right? The woman nodded, though her throat was tight. She had no words for the quiet power she had just witnessed. The cabin emptied slowly. Passengers filed out, some stopping to exchange whispers about the man they had just encountered. Others simply shook their heads, still trying to process the calm authority that had radiated from him the entire flight. By the time the woman finally stood to leave, the terminal had become a quiet hum of activity. She walked past the area where reporters were still photographing and recording, catching glimpses of officers escorting him toward the waiting vehicle. Her mind replayed every moment of the flight, the accusations, the muttered words, the silent composure, and finally, the measured exit. It was a lesson in humility she would never forget. Outside the plane, the man entered a vehicle surrounded by uniformed officers. His posture was perfect, confident, calm, dignified. Cameras flashed and reporters whispered, but he did not flinch. He did not speak unnecessarily. Everything about him conveyed authority without arrogance, calm without detachment, and in that moment the woman realized she had not only misjudged him, but had also underestimated the power of quiet confidence. She had expected confrontation, maybe even anger, and instead she had witnessed respect earned simply through composure, dignity, and poise. The vehicle pulled away slowly, and the woman finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She had come onto the flight convinced of her assumptions, only to leave humbled and aware of her own prejudices. By the time she left the plane herself, the story of the flight had already begun spreading through whispered conversations among the remaining passengers. A story of humility, dignity, and quiet strength. A story that would not be forgotten. And the woman knew deep down that the man in seat 2A had changed something in her that no apology could fix. The understanding that respect and power were not shown through loud voices or harsh words, but through composure, patience, and quiet authority. She looked out the window one last time as he disappeared into the waiting vehicle, and she realized that the world was much bigger than her own assumptions. She had just witnessed someone extraordinary, and she had no idea of the full story yet. The morning in Los Angeles was bright and warm, with sunlight streaming through the terminal windows. The sounds of rolling suitcases, announcements over the PA, and the quiet murmur of travelers filled the large space. The passengers who had just disembarked from the flight were moving toward baggage claim or the exit, still talking in low voices about the unusual events on board. The woman who had spent the flight beside the man in seat 2A stood frozen for a moment near the jet bridge. Her heart still raced, her mind replaying the encounter over and over. She couldn't stop thinking about the calm authority, the quiet dignity, and the effortless way he had handled every situation during the flight. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how wrong she had been to judge him. Outside, a sleek black vehicle was waiting. Uniformed officers were gathered around, standing at attention. Cameras were already flashing from a distance, and several reporters had gathered, murmuring quietly among themselves. The woman watched as the man approached the vehicle, officers flanking him on both sides. Even from a distance, she could see the ease in his movements, deliberate, controlled, and completely natural. She felt a wave of shame wash over her. All the assumptions she had carried, all the rude words and gestures, all the frustration and arrogance, it seemed meaningless now. She had treated someone she thought was ordinary as though he didn't belong in a place he had every right to be. And yet here he was, not only unfazed but commanding respect without a single raised voice. Passengers who had been near him on the flight whispered among themselves. "He's military, right? one asked quietly. Look at how they treat him. Another passenger nodded. Yeah, and it's not just the officers, even the crew respects him. You can feel it. The woman listened, her stomach twisting. She couldn't believe she had been so quick to assume and so eager to humiliate someone who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Her own arrogance had made her blind, and now, watching the scene unfold, she could see the full weight of her mistake. The man opened the door to the vehicle and stepped in, turning slightly to wave politely at the gathered reporters. Cameras flashed as the officers gave a subtle nod and moved to their positions, surrounding him. He settled into the seat with the same calm that had defined him throughout the flight, a quiet authority radiating from him. A reporter stepped forward, voice steady but respectful. Sir, can you tell us who you are? You handled the situation on the plane so calmly, and everyone here seems to recognize you. The man looked at the reporter, his expression calm, almost serene. I appreciate your interest, he said, but I prefer not to discuss my identity publicly right now. What matters is that people treat each other with respect, regardless of appearances or assumptions. The reporters nodded, some lowering their cameras, sensing the weight of his words, but whispers still spread through the terminal. People were trying to piece together who he could possibly be. Someone whose presence commanded that much respect without a single boast. Someone who had handled confrontation with ease, grace, and humility. Meanwhile, the woman watched from her place in the terminal, slowly sinking onto a nearby bench. Her hands trembled slightly, and she felt a knot of embarrassment she couldn't shake. She had come onto that flight certain of her assumptions, full of confidence that she was right about who belonged where. But those assumptions had been shattered. She had learned a lesson, and it stung. Other passengers who had remained near the gate began talking quietly. Did you see how she was acting next to him? One said. She had no idea who he was, another nodded. Yeah, she humiliated him without even realizing. But the way he handled it, it's incredible. So calm, so dignified. The woman buried her face in her hands, wishing she could rewind time. Every action she had taken, the harsh words, the judgmental stares, the frustration, now seemed small and foolish. She had underestimated someone extraordinary, someone who didn't need to shout or prove himself because his presence alone commanded respect. Suddenly, a uniformed officer approached the edge of the terminal, looking directly at her. She lifted her head slowly, unsure of what to expect. Ma'am, the officer said politely but firmly, the gentleman you were sitting next to is a highly respected figure. What happened on the flight has already been noted, and we appreciate your understanding of the situation. The woman's face flushed deeply. I understand, she said softly, her voice trembling. She could hardly believe the words were coming out of her mouth. I didn't know I'm sorry, the officer nodded, acknowledging it as a good first step. Treating people with respect even when you don't know them is what matters most. She nodded again, swallowing hard, feeling the weight of her arrogance slowly lift. This wasn't about punishment. It was about learning. Meanwhile, the vehicle carrying the man slowly moved away from the terminal. The officers flanking him maintained their positions, their movements precise and professional. The reporters whispered among themselves, capturing the moment, though the man himself remained quiet, composed, and dignified. Passengers who had witnessed the entire sequence of events were still talking quietly, marveling at what they had just seen. I can't believe we sat next to him, one whispered. The way he handled everything, it's like he's untouchable, another added. You don't even need to know his full story to respect him. Just watching him, you can feel it. Back in the terminal, the woman remained seated, reflecting on every moment of the flight. She remembered the accusations, the judgmental words she had whispered under her breath, and the attempts to assert dominance over someone who had done nothing wrong. She remembered the way passengers had begun noticing, the way the crew had treated him with subtle but unmistakable respect, and the calm authority with which he had navigated conflict. For the first time in her life, she felt truly humbled. She realized that assumptions and prejudice were easy to carry, but they could be completely misleading. Respect, dignity, and true power didn't need to be shouted or flaunted. They could exist quietly, effortlessly, and command attention simply through presence and composure. Her mind replayed the final moments before the man had entered the waiting vehicle. She had seen the calm nod, the polite acknowledgement, the gentle smile. He hadn't sought revenge, didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat. He had shown instead that humility and strength could exist in the same person. Even now, as the vehicle disappeared from sight, she couldn't shake the impression he had left. Her arrogance, her assumptions, her anger, all had been stripped away by witnessing someone who had faced ignorance and prejudice with nothing more than quiet dignity. Passengers around her began moving toward baggage claim, still whispering. Some speculated aloud about who the man could be, piecing together fragments from the crew, the officers, and their own observations. The woman listened quietly, realizing that the mystery was secondary to the lesson. It didn't matter who he was. What mattered was what he represented. Calm strength, respect earned, and dignity maintained even in the face of disrespect. She finally stood, feeling lighter than she had in hours. She walked toward the baggage claim, reflecting on how differently she would approach people from now on. She realized that judging someone without understanding them, without knowing their story, could lead to unnecessary conflict and embarrassment. The story of the flight would not end there. Within hours, whispers had spread to social media. Passengers shared their accounts, and the quiet heroism of the man in seat 2A began to be recognized far beyond the terminal. People marveled not at fame or title, but at his composure, his patience, and the quiet power of someone who didn't need to prove themselves. Back in her own mind, the woman carried a lesson she would never forget. She had come into that flight confident, assuming the worst, eager to assert herself. And yet she had been humbled, shown a new perspective, and reminded that respect and dignity were earned, not assumed. Even without knowing his full identity, she understood something more important than any title or rank. The man had faced ignorance and prejudice, had stayed calm, and had taught everyone around him a lesson through action rather than words. As she finally left the terminal, the sun bright on her face, she realized the full weight of what she had witnessed. Some lessons are quiet, subtle, and almost invisible at first, but when they settle, they change a person. And the flight she had taken that morning would change her forever. She took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief, humility, and newfound understanding. She knew she would carry this story with her, the story of a man who commanded respect not by shouting or asserting dominance, but through calmness, dignity, and quiet authority. A man who, without ever raising his voice, had reminded everyone on that flight, and especially her, what it truly meant to be extraordinary. And though she didn't know his name or the full details of his work, she would never forget the presence, the composure, and the silent lesson he had left behind. It was a lesson more powerful than any words, more lasting than any confrontation, and far more important than anyone could have imagined. In the end, the flight had been more than a journey across the country. It had been a journey of understanding, humility, and recognition that true power lies not in assumption or prejudice, but in quiet strength and dignity. The woman finally left the terminal, her steps slower, thoughtful, and changed forever.